Have you ever looked out of an airplane window and noticed that the clouds are far below you? At that moment, you're cruising nearly 35,000 feet above Earth, higher than most mountains and far above the weather. But here's the real question. If flying higher is better, why don't passenger planes fly at 50,000 feet instead? The answer involves physics, fuel, powerful jet streams, and one invisible limit that every airliner must respect. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why just a few thousand feet can mean the difference between an efficient flight and a dangerous one. The hidden reason airlines fly so high. Most people think airlines cruise high simply because there's less traffic. That's only part of the story. The biggest reason is fuel efficiency. Near the ground, the atmosphere is dense. Every second an aircraft flies, it has to push through billions of air molecules, creating drag that constantly slows it down. The engines must burn enormous amounts of fuel just to maintain speed. At around 35,000 feet, the air is roughly 75% less dense than at sea level. With much less drag, the engines don't have to work nearly as hard. Considering that fuel often represents 30 to 40% of an airline's operating costs, even small improvements save millions of dollars every year. On a long-haul flight, a wide-body jet may burn more than 70 tons of fuel. As that fuel disappears, the aircraft becomes lighter. That's why pilots often perform what's called a step climb. Instead of staying at one altitude, they gradually climb higher during the flight, where thinner air allows even greater efficiency. One simple altitude change can save hundreds or even thousands of dollars on a single journey. Then, why not fly even higher? If thinner air is better, why stop at 35,000 feet? Because jet engines have a serious limitation. They need oxygen. A turbofan engine compresses air, mixes it with fuel, and burns that mixture to create thrust. As altitude increases, oxygen becomes increasingly scarce. Eventually, the engines simply cannot generate enough power efficiently. But engines aren't the only problem. The wings also need air. Lift exists because air flows around the wing. Too little air means too little lift. Climb too high, and the airplane can no longer support its own weight. Engineers call this limit the service ceiling, the highest altitude where the aircraft can still fly safely and efficiently. The invisible highways in the sky. Here's something many passengers never realize. Airliners don't simply fly through the sky. They ride rivers of wind. These are called jet streams. Fast-moving air currents high in the atmosphere can exceed 250 miles per hour, 400 kilometers per hour. When an aircraft heading east crosses one of these winds, its ground speed increases dramatically without burning extra fuel. A flight from New York to London can arrive nearly 90 minutes earlier simply by taking advantage of favorable jet streams. The return flight, however, usually takes longer because those same winds are now blowing against the aircraft. This is why flight paths often look curved instead of perfectly straight. Pilots aren't taking the long route. They're taking the fastest one. Flying high means smoother flights. There's another major advantage. Most turbulence lives much lower in the atmosphere. Thunderstorms, unstable air, and towering clouds usually remain below cruising altitude. By flying above them, airliners avoid much of the rough air passengers dislike. However, one type of turbulence still exists. It's called clear air turbulence. It forms where fast-moving air masses collide, even in perfectly blue skies. Because weather radar cannot detect it, pilots often ask passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened even when everything outside looks calm. Why flying lower isn't a good idea when aircraft must fly lower because of weather, air traffic restrictions, or operational reasons. But doing so comes at a price. Lower altitude means denser air. That creates more drag, increases fuel consumption, and exposes the aircraft to stronger turbulence and storms. Modern airliners are actually designed to spend most of their journey in the thin air around 35,000 feet. It's where they perform best. Altitude can save lives. Surprisingly, flying high also improves safety. Imagine an aircraft suddenly loses engine power. At cruising altitude, it doesn't simply fall, it glides. A modern airliner can glide more than 60 miles, 100 kilometers, without engine thrust. That gives pilots valuable time to restart engines, contact air traffic control, and prepare for an emergency landing. One famous example occurred in 1982, when British Airways Flight 9 flew into volcanic ash over Indonesia. All 4 engines failed. The Boeing 747 became a giant glider at 37,000 feet. For 13 terrifying minutes, the crew descended while repeatedly attempting engine restarts. Eventually, 3 engines came back to life, and the aircraft landed safely. All 263 people on board survived. Without that altitude, the outcome could have been very different. The invisible wall above every airliner. So why don't modern passenger aircraft climb even higher? Because eventually they reach what pilots call the Coffin Corner. At extreme altitude, the difference between flying too slowly and too fast becomes incredibly small. Fly slightly slower and the wings lose lift. Fly slightly faster and aerodynamic limits may be exceeded. The airplane operates inside an extremely narrow safety margin. Add lower oxygen levels for the engines and the risks of cabin depressurization, and it's clear why commercial jets rarely fly above 41,000 feet. Could future airliners fly higher? Possibly.